Okay.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Those of you that have joined us today with the Lemon Grove Community Garden. I'm Anita Lopez, a member of the steering committee. And we have put together a series of workshops. Today's workshop will be on tree care. And we're really focusing on how do we care for trees that we have been giving away in our tree giveaway. But most specifically, what are some practical advice that we can give you so that you are able to steward in your tree, plant it correctly, and really be, stewards of climate action, and also really enjoy the edible fruits that may come with it, and provide us with some protections against heat. My name, again, is Anita Lopez, and I'm presenting today in partnership with a couple of our fellow environmentalists. So I will share a little bit about today's presenters. Robin Rive is an ISA certified arborist, and she is joining us very graciously because she's quite knowledgeable and has been in and around all of this work for a very long time, meaning she is very well experienced and knowledgeable. Robin promotes public policy to plant trees for climate and food resilience. She is a consulting horticulturist and a UCCE master gardener, with a focus on providing residents, municipalities, and schools with education, planning, and design. She is joined by McKenna Call, one of our Lemon Grove Community Garden members. And McKenna is a Lemon Grove Community Garden member since 2021. She has a passion for supporting and implementing sustainable and climate-focused projects. You can see her here with a seed library that she has developed, and I'm sure if you have any questions, you can reach out to her. She started her career with Tree San Diego and is currently a sustainability analyst with San Diego Gas and Electric. So I would like to pass this presentation over to McKenna and Robin. And please feel free to throw anything in the chat. I will be monitoring that. We will have a question and answer at the end. Should anything come up, feel free to chat us and I will respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Awesome. My thumbs up, it's on?
Yes.
Awesome. So as Anita said, we're going to talk about how to care in the near term and long term for the trees included in the Lemon Grove Community Garden tree giveaway. Today, we're going to talk about these species as it relates to watering, nutrients, pruning guidance, and some common problems. Really want it to be interactive and fun, so feel free to raise your hand or put things in the chat like Anita said. So jumping right into it, we're going to start with the Chinese pistache. Does anyone know what a deciduous tree is? John?
It's a tree that loses its leaves, all the foliage seasonally.
Yes.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, it's right.
Good.
And a Chinese pistache is a deciduous tree. They grow new leaves in the spring. A couple different examples of deciduous trees are oaks, maple, and elm. And looking at the care of the Chinese pistache, young trees are going to want more water so they can become established. Robin?
I just want to comment that here in San Diego, oaks and elms actually are usually not deciduous, just for people's benefit.
Thanks for that added color. Appreciate it. As trees are, as you first plant them, you want to make sure they're getting enough water so they're able to establish and grow those first roots, maybe watering once a week. But the most important thing is feeling the soil with your hand to make sure that see how wet or dry it is. You don't want your soil to be like beach sand, and making sure you let the soil dry out before watering it again. After a few years, once the tree has established, you can water less often. What is best is deep and frequent watering. So this is where you let the soil dry out and then you water it again and make sure you're watering it deep so the water can percolate down deep to help the roots grow farther into the ground. And as your tree is growing, the canopy or the leaves at the top will grow out. So watering around the canopy line to make sure that the roots that are growing outwards are getting enough water as well. Because if you water just around the base of the tree, then it won't get enough water in the other areas where roots are growing. And then in terms of nutrients, the Chinese pistache, if it's not growing or has some yellowing leaves after the first year, you can consider putting a nitrogen-based fertilizer. As I've learned, you can always add a layer of compost annually if that is helpful or of interest to you. And some common problems with this tree are verticillium. I think that's caused by a fungi, and then some root rot, which can be from overwatering. When you're looking to prune your Chinese pistache tree, you definitely want to make sure you're not pruning too much of it off at one time. If you remove too much of the canopy, then the tree can become sunburned. And once a tree is sunburned, it becomes weak and could be susceptible to wood-boring insects. So keep that in mind. And our next tree that is also deciduous that we'll be talking about is the crepe myrtle. Trivia here is, does anyone know where the crepe myrtle tree is native to and where it was first introduced in the US? Feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat.
I would make a rough guess China, but I don't know.
Any other guesses? Anita?
I want to say India or some part of the Asian continent.
Good guesses. From my research, what I learned is that the crepe myrtle is native to Southeast Asia in China. So John, great job. And then does anybody know where it was introduced to in the US first?
I'm guessing the East Coast.
John, you're hitting them all today. That's great. Yes, it was introduced in Charleston, South Carolina around 1786 and introduced by Andre Michaud, a plant explorer and botanist, to King Louis XVI. But one of the first South Asian plants to be introduced to the US. And like the other tree we just discussed, the Chinese pistache, crepe myrtle will need more water in the beginning to make sure the tree is established. You want to let the soil dry out in between the watering applications, making sure you're feeling a couple inches down with your fingers into the soil to make sure how moist it is or not moist it is, meaning you're going to need some water, and reducing water as the tree grows to infrequent deep watering. After a couple of years or so, the crepe myrtle tree owner can consider adding a light fertilization in spring and summer, but definitely want to be careful about adding too much fertilizer because that will reduce the amount of blooms. And some common problems with the crepe myrtle are powdery mildew, sooty mold, and aphids. And Anita, did you have your hand up?
I did. So can we go back one slide?
Of
So
course.
one of my challenges as kind of a very, very green, shall I say, tree planter is really, and gardener, honestly, is understanding sort of some of the terms. So one of them would be, I understand what powdery mildew might look like, but I have no idea what sooty mold would look like. I know what aphids are. So could you share, anybody on the panel, what I could look for a sooty mold or anything like that?
I can answer that.
Awesome.
Basically, aphids are very common in San Diego, and interestingly, aphids are generally born pregnant, so they're all female, and they secrete a substance that basically then molds. And so sooty mold is often in conjunction with an insect like aphids. And there is a honeydew that gets secreted from the aphids, and then it molds basically. So it's like a sugary substance that then molds. It's carbon, and it's susceptible to molding, just like the food in your fridge. So, and you often see it as like black spots that almost look like a bunch of carbon on the leaves. The best thing to do with all three of those things is just get a nice hard water spray from your hose and wash it all off. And you really shouldn't probably put any chemicals on those things to solve them.
Excellent. Thank you.
And we might want to mention, Robin taught me this. You want to make sure you don't wet the leaves or do the spraying off in the afternoon, because if the water sits on the leaves overnight, it can cause mold and powdery mildew. I have definitely made that mistake in my own garden last summer when I first started, but now we know.
And also, interestingly enough, this is something about mildew, is people associate it with wet, but actually mildew doesn't survive in water. It's very, very prone to happening in May gray and June gloom, when we have a lot of overcast weather. So there's a lot of moisture in the air, but that's more the foggy stuff. And that's what will produce the mildews. But you can actually wash mildew off with water, and water will kill the mildew spores. And
Kills the spores?
well, it basically, yes, they don't thrive when they're wet. They only thrive when they're damp. So, and crepe myrtles are prone to mildew, but in Lemon Grove, if you get the hybrid crepe myrtles, and I don't know which ones were distributed because there's quite a variety of crepe myrtles, but hopefully they did distribute the hybrids. Usually they have names, and they are much less prone to powdery mildew.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Robin. Moving on to the Coast Live Oak. Does anyone know why it's called a live oak? Robin hinted at this earlier.
It lives for a long time.
I think it's a host to a lot of other animals and things. I don't know if maybe that's the reason.
Great responses.
It's green all year. Doesn't drop its leaves.
Ding, ding, ding. That's Walt. Yes, the live comes from that the Coast Live Oak is evergreen oak. And then does anyone know about the uses the oak had for the Kumeyaay natives, since Coast Live Oak was native to this region before colonization and population?
Yeah, I think the acorns were an important food source.
Robin, you had your hand up?
No, I was dittoing what he said.
Oh,
It's
awesome.
just the fruit, even though a lot of people don't think of an acorn as being a fruit, but basically it has starch and it's edible. May not be your chosen meal for the day, but definitely at a time when food distribution and agriculture were in their early stages, it was a good source of nutrition.
Most definitely. So acorns were used as a staple food for the Kumeyaay. They were processed into a mush after going through a long process of processing them. Interestingly, also the bark was used to treat toothaches, and then a concoction of the chip bark was used to wash sores off, as well as wood being used for firing pottery.
And just because I interjected earlier about oaks, I grew up on the East Coast when virtually all oaks are deciduous. And so when you read about, like in botany books or plant books, they just neglect the southwestern United States. So you'll see that elms and oaks and maples are all deciduous, but we don't grow maples here. And our oaks and elms are generally evergreen. So you have to be careful where you source all that information for everybody's benefit.
Thank you. Definitely that information must have came from the East Coast. So now we know. Now, because the coast live oak is a native tree, it's not going to need as much water, but definitely still want to continue watering it. Definitely once a week the first year, making sure that soil is able to dry out before you water it again. Remember, we don't want beach sand, just lightly dry before you drench the tree again. After established, the tree likely does not need as much water or any water at all. The cupped leaves on the tree have evolved to be cupped when it is hot, so it can reduce transpiration, meaning the tree can hold on to its water better. And coast live oak doesn't need much fertilization because they are native to the area, used to the soils. And then in terms of problems, coast live oak can be susceptible to many, many different problems. And I'm sure we all heard about the gold spotted oak borer, but these problems don't occur until the plant necessarily gets older. With proper care, research, resources, which we'll be giving out, and professional advice, oaks can thrive. And then our next evergreen tree and a tree supporting food forests and food security is the pineapple guava tree. Has anyone tasted a fruit from this tree and wants to share what that fruit might have tasted like? John?
Yeah, they're wonderful, quite sweet, with a sour accent. A little bit like kiwi, if I had to compare it to something, but they're a little bit more aromatic. I wish I was better at explaining what the flavor was like. It's been a while since I've had one, but they're really delicious. And you can actually, it took me a long time before I realized you could eat the peel as well. And they have a very kind of a thin peel skin on them. And so it's just a great, we had one for many years. It produced, we really didn't fertilize it, so it did stop producing fruit after a while. So even though I did put on some compost periodically, but for some reason it stopped producing. So maybe you could help me understand why that occurred. Yeah.
Robin, yeah.
That sometimes is a result of cross-pollination. And so if you just have one variety of pineapple guava, you may not get as much fruit production as if you had two different varieties.
Well, produced probably 1,000 fruits a year for 10 or so years, and then it just kind of puckered out, you know. So.
I also read online, and I have a little bit more on this on the next slide or two, that the amount you water it does impact the fruit.
Yeah, I kind of noticed that. It really did need a certain regular watering. Yeah.
And maybe Robin, you can help me understand. Does this fruit need pollination from another tree nearby, or are they some self-fertile?
Well, almost all fruit trees benefit from more than one. Some absolutely need them. Some just do better when there's more than one. Some things like avocado, the male flowers and the female flowers open at different times of the day. There's a lot of differences with fruit trees about how they produce fruit. Sometimes a tree will produce like thousands and thousands of fruit right before it's ready to die. because it knows it's struggling and it's trying to reproduce. So there's a lot of things to understand about how trees work. The other thing, John, and I hope this wasn't in your case, but a lot of times by the time a tree is in that 10-year-old plus, before it's like 20, is when if there was a problem at planting or with the nursery quality, that's about the time that a tree may decline because the roots were not properly spread out. So it's possible that your tree got to a certain size and the root ball then started compromising the tree's ability to pull up water and send enough sugar down. So that is another possibility.
Okay,
Thanks for that. And to go back to what the pineapple guava tree fruit tastes like, John, you were spot on. Kiwi is what the internet has told me. I have not had the pleasure to taste one of these. I know Anita has a pineapple guava tree. Have you tasted one before?
I have not, but I'm looking forward to it. I also looked it up online, and I think even on the label, it's a Fajoa. Is that the same as the Acacelowiana? I don't even know how to say that. Yes, thank you, Robin.
Yeah, Fajoa used to be the genus, and leave it to the botanists and the taxonomy people to keep renaming plants. But because we now can do DNA analysis of tree genetics, we're able to reclassify a tree's lineage. So this is one of the species that got moved out of Fajoa and it got put into Aca. So Fajoa was the name of it. And I can tell you the people in New Zealand, where Fajoas are not only one of the most popular fruits, but there's all sorts of cultivars of them down there, probably weren't very happy with the taxonomy being changed. And as for taste, we have a Fajoa, or a pineapple guava. And most people really love it. I'm not one of them. I think it's okay, but for me, it tastes kind of like a gooseberry, which is not my favorite fruit. But if you like that sort of a taste, I think that I don't dislike it. I mean, I don't hate it. It's just not my favorite flavor.
It's good to know about the name changing. And yes, the other fruit that they compared the pineapple guava tree fruit to taste like were banana, pineapple, and guava is the name. But with that, we can move into some of the care. What we were kind of talking about earlier with John and his tree, definitely want regular watering for the pineapple guava tree. And you'll want more watering in the beginning to make sure the tree is well established. And as time goes on, you can reduce watering the frequency, but increase the amount, deep infrequent watering. And in terms of fertilization, you can apply a fertilizer 1 to 2 times a year. They suggest 2 times a year in a pot, and also adding compost can add other macro and microorganisms or nutrients to the soil for the tree to use. And the common problems with pineapple guava a owner might see is black scale and fruit flies. And talking a little bit more about the pineapple guava fruit, you can expect fruit sometime after 3 years. Plants will bloom in the spring, ripen and grow and fall off the tree in the fall. And once the fruit has fallen off the tree onto the ground, that is when it is ripe and ready to eat. And another interesting thing I learned is that the flowers are also edible. One thing I'm curious to learn is if you can eat the flowers off these trees, will they still grow the fruit? Robin, do you know anything about that?
No, if you eat the flowers, the tree will still grow fruit, but the flower that you ate will not become a fruit.
I did read on the internet last night that if you eat just the petals, it'll still bear fruit. It has a lot of red pistils and stamens in the middle. You don't touch those, but if you eat the pink petals on the outside, it apparently, according to the internet, it will still produce fruit.
And the truth is, usually there's plenty of both. And so most people don't eat that many petals. I mean, you can collect a little handful and put some in a salad, and you're still going to get plenty of fruit on your tree. So I've never heard of anybody that was worried about not getting enough pineapple guava by eating too many of the flowers.
Good to know.
And the
Yeah, that
flowers-
reminded me, one of the problems we were experiencing was it started to drop the fruit prematurely before it was ripe. So I think that was probably a watering issue, if I recall correctly. It just won't continue to grow the fruit if it doesn't get enough water. It just lets them go. Yeah.
And the flowers taste quite different. They're just kind of sweet and pleasant, and they're not sour like the fruit has at all. They're not subacid is what they would call it.
So Robin, would you put the flowers on a dessert maybe? Like a nice little piece of
Yeah,
fruit?
you could put them in a salad, or yeah, I mean, they're beautiful, and they kind of taste like, I don't know how to describe them. Just very
Flowers.
pleasant and sweet.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing your experiences and knowledge. It really makes this presentation workshop really nice and supplemental for everybody listening now and listening later. Moving on to our last tree species in the Lemon Grove Community Garden giveaway. This is the Mandarin orange tree. Our last trivia questions for today are, what are the best times to water a tree or a yard? And then when is the best time to water trees on a hot day? And this can be for trees or your garden or your plants at home.
Well, I like to do it a little bit because I heard that it's not good to water in the middle of the day if the sun's really bright and hot. But I understand that from an evaporation, definitely point of view, from that point of view, you're going to get more evaporation, obviously. I imagine once it kind of is in the ground, you wouldn't get a lot of evaporation. But the other thing is that there are some plants that have kind of little hairs, and the water can form a drop on the hairs suspended above the actual leaf surface. And the sun will go through that water drop, and it will act just like a magnifying glass, and that could actually burn the leaf. So that's really the only reason you wouldn't want to necessarily water in the middle of the hot sun day, because you could get on some kind of plants with little hairs. It's because of the burning. But other than that, I don't think it's really a problem to water when it's sunny. And then at night, people are saying if the leaves stay wet, you're going to get more mold or mildew growing. So it might be better to water in the morning so it has a chance to dry out during the day. How's that? What? Well, Robin?
Well, I was just thinking of another idea about the heat, is that if you can anticipate that it's going to be a hot day, like I think we all knew today was going to be a hot day. So if you did have a garden, yesterday would have been a good time to saturate your soil so that the tree is now, or your garden is prepared to handle the hot day better,
Oh, yeah.
rather than waiting until it's actually hot and dry.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yes. So, John, you're definitely right. Don't water in the middle of the day because we don't want evaporation from the soil. We want it to soak in. So best times to water are in the morning. And if you're watering just the soil, not the foliage of plants or trees, you can water in the late afternoon.
There is another risk as well, is that one of the most serious root diseases is Phytophthora. And generally it loves hot moisture. So if your soil heats up and it's moist, that is the time that's going to breed some of these really dangerous pathogens. And I say dangerous, they really can kill your tree. So again, you don't want your trees to dry out, but on the other hand, if it's just too wet and too hot at the same time, it can be a risk. Usually with too much water and too much heat.
Well, in nature, when it rains, it's not sunny, so evolutionary speaking, it really doesn't know how to handle water when it's sunny because it didn't evolve that way, right? So,
Unless you're in the tropical rainforest down at the tropics, but we're here at, I think, 32, 33 degrees north latitude. So definitely follow what Robin is saying. And for mandarin orange tree care, you'll want to water around the root ball once or twice a week, weather permitting. Once the soil has dried out, you can feel the soil with your hands, make sure that it is not like beach sand, and if so, you waited too long. And as the tree canopy grows out, water around the canopy line to make sure all the roots are getting water. In terms of nutrients for mandarin trees, you can apply a layer of compost annually, and there are other soil amends you can add, or organic citrus fertilizers you can add that can be helpful to your tree. And like all other trees, there can be a host of problems, but with proper care and research and professional advice, they can be curbed. And I know Walt is on the call and he is a mandarin tree owner, so he's definitely a great resource if you have questions, as well as Robin. And Walt, you want to say something?
Oh, yeah, I just want to say that I've had my mandarin tree now for about 17 years. I got it at a 5-gallon from Home Depot, and I stuck it in the ground, and I watered it once or twice a week the first 6 months or year. After that, I just go out there on a Saturday morning, throw the hose down a couple feet away from the stem, uphill a little bit, and just let it run for 4 or 5 minutes. And that's it. And I've trimmed it like twice in 17 years. Once the branches get like way down long, I just trim it. And it gives fruit for like 4 or 5 months of the year, from like January through May or June. It's an incredible tree. Not much problems at all. So I love it. I don't know if you can see my little tree there. It's hard to see, but there it is.
Oh, we love
Tons
it.
of-
Thank you so
tons
much, Walt.
Tons and tons of fruit, and John can attest to the taste.
yeah, so I can vouch for the fruits. They're unbelievably sweet. Some of the sweetest fruit I've ever had in my life.
Robin, did you want to say something? You might be on mute.
Yeah, what variety is it? Do you know?
It's the golden mandarin.
Oh, Gold Nugget,
Yeah, gold nugget.
good one.
And then I think in our tree giveaway, I looked at the pots that I had. We gave away the standard mandarin. But basically these trees will produce fruit in early winter to spring. That's what the internet said. So if you all who have mandarin trees have better estimates of time frame, feel free.
Now,
Go ahead.
McKenna, when you say standard, does it say standard on it?
STD dot, like standard mandarin.
That might mean the size. That might mean it's a full-size orange tree rather than being a standard cultivar. Usually that word standard applies to the rootstock, not to the, which would be a little risky because if people are hoping to plant a standard tree in a pot, that's not going to work if it really is a standard rootstock. I've never heard of a tree cultivar called a standard.
Yeah, the 2 cultivars that we got at the beginning, we were able to get some Tango. And then most of the rest of the trees, the last 7 mandarins were all Algerian mandarins.
This is great. Thank you so much. Now I learned something myself here today. Definitely good. So different cultivars, and they were the first ones that I planted were, I guess, on standard rootstock. But if you are planting in containers using a well draining soil is really important. They have this at Home Depot, but make sure you're not using any additional potting soil if you are planting in the ground.
Some citrus produces twice a year, don't they?
I'm not
In this
sure.
climate?
Robin, do you know? And I see Anita's hands up next. We'll go.
Well,
back.
there's certainly lemons that will produce all year. And I've never really heard of two separate bloom cycles, but you often will get like a constant ripening, because if the blooms happen over 3 or 4 months, then there will be some ripening sooner than others. So it may appear that you've got 2 cycles, but not like figs, which may have a separate spring crop and a fall crop.
Yeah,
Okay.
my tree the first couple of years was very inconsistent as to when it flowered and set fruit. So I had it, like less fruit then the first couple of years, but inconsistent, like, from November through July. Now it's kind of settled down as it's gotten older, and it has like hundreds of fruits on that tree. And, it's only about 9 feet tall and about 7 feet wide. And it blossoms consistently, I think, in the fall. And then from like late December through June, it has fruit that's edible. So it's great.
Awesome. Let's go to Anita next. She had her hand up.
I actually just wanted to make a comment for those that are going to be watching this later.
Yeah.
Is that, and especially for those that we have given trees away to, we'll be sure to include the information on the variety or the cultivar that you have, just so when you are looking it up, you're clear about what you have. Clearly, labeling can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So because Walt knows which trees he got, he can share that with me, and then we can pass that on to the rest of the folks that are part of our tree giveaway. Yes, Robin.
If the mandarins are standard, that's sort of good news as well as difficult news, depending on where someone's planting it. But, I've been a big advocate for standard rootstock because it's a good hedge against climate change. A lot of people don't realize when you get dwarfing rootstocks, it also means that trees are less vigorous. And so our climate is going to be a lot more hostile over the next few decades, no matter what we do. And I think people that have standard trees are going to fare better than people with super dwarfing species. So, it could be a blessing in disguise if these really were standard trees. They may get bigger, but bigger is okay. You can always share your fruit.
Oh, I love that. And then that kind of wraps up what we're going to talk about for the tree species guidance. And then we just have a little bit on pruning and an activity. And if there's not enough time, we can just go straight to questions. But in terms of pruning, deciduous trees that become dormant in the winter, like Chinese pistache and crepe myrtle, these should be pruned in the winter regularly. And from what I've learned, less pruning is always better. Robin, do you want to talk about pruning of trees and maybe like planting of crepe myrtles?
Okay, well, I think that as an arborist, I can say that we learned that there was only 4 reasons to prune trees at all, and we call them the 4 Ds. And essentially that means if there's dead wood, you take it out. If there's decay, disease, and then the other one is called deformed. So deformed might mean that a tree looks like this picture right here on the left, but let's say you want to walk underneath that crepe myrtle. So maybe you only want to leave one limb straight up. You might prune out everything else, not because the tree benefits, but because that's what you want. So you might look at that as a deformity. But in general, that's the only reason to prune. If you do like the picture on the right, where you've cut like the top of the limb off, it will shoot all those side branches all out at once, which is typical for pruning any plant. And they're called epicormic shoots. And basically you don't want to leave all those because then the tree will become top heavy and more subject to breakage. In general, trees, I hate to tell people this, but they were on the planet before us. They didn't need our tending or our pruning. So it's usually only our needs are the reason that trees get pruned. So less is more. You may want to tip prune a little bit if you want to increase the bloom. In parts of the East Coast, they hack crepe myrtles, and it's a certain style. I don't agree with it. I don't think we should do it here. It's also important, if you haven't already planted your trees, to make sure that the base where the trunk meets the root is almost showing about an inch above the grade level of the soil. And that's very important for planting a tree. So if you haven't already planted your tree, keep that in mind.
Thank you, Robin. And then we have a little bit of information about evergreen pruning. So evergreens, trees like the pineapple guava, coast live oak, and mandarin orange rarely need pruning. One can get the dead drooping branches. Robin just talked about the 4Ds. That was a great tip. Thank you. One thing you don't want to do in pruning is we want to avoid making trees into a lollipop. That's where they have like one trunk and then just a circular type canopy. Robin, why don't we want trees to be lollipop shaped?
Well, generally, I mean, the pictures you showed here are sort of a good example where you can kind of see through the branches on the tree on the left, but the tree on the right, it almost looks like it's almost the same tree. And in this case, there's multiple trunks, which is okay. But if it gets like pruned, like with a hedge pruner, it will just get denser and denser and denser. And then you'll get all those crossing branches and you'll get too much foliage that the tree can actually sustain. And that's when you end up getting these diseases and insect pests. There's too much foliage and not enough ability for wind to pass through. Lots of things happen because it's basically not a natural environment anymore. And once you do it, it's just like topping a tree. It never really recovers. If a tree has been topped and pruned improperly, it can take a decade or more to try to retrain it again. And sometimes it's never going to be the same.
Awesome.
What's the problem with crossing branches?
Well, think about this as, well, they rub against each other. And so if a branch is growing like this, and they will eventually grow together, and the bark where the bark is meeting the bark, or sometimes even like this, the place where the bark seam is prone to splitting. It's often a place where you'll get insects thriving, and water can get in and start penetrating and rotting wood. So all sorts of evil things happen when you do improper pruning.
Oh, so that's the problem, is when two branches actually make contact and grow into each other. That's where the problem lies.
So
Okay.
if you get underneath your tree canopy, it's always better if you see it happening. That's the nip, the little nip. My philosophy is if you should prune your trees only with a hand pruner, and you shouldn't need a chainsaw, because if you prune it properly with a hand pruner, at most a lopper, that's all your trees should ever need.
Great information. Thank you. I know we're coming up on time, but we do have some pruning resources. This information will be made available to you through the presentation. And then we also have some digital tree resources from Robin. Thank you so much for providing these and sharing this with the garden and all the people included in the Lemon Grove Community Garden Tree Giveaway. There's some great information about myths of trees and other resources for fruiting and ornamental trees that we're giving away. I did have an activity with what types of trees you can identify, but for the sake of time, I'm going to say, let's move to questions. Are there any questions anybody would like to ask or comments?
Yeah, when a tree gets kind of big, so I have a pretty large fig tree, not huge, but, and watering it is a bit of a challenge because if I were to stand there with a hose, I mean, it has a large, root drip line, and it'll take me a long time. So what I typically do is just put the hose on a slight drip, which is a challenge just to adjust the faucet to get a drip because it always starts out big and it, for some reason, which I haven't figured out, it scales back and it maybe even turn itself off. I don't know why faucets do that, but I don't know if you've ever noticed that problem when you try to water trees. But what I'm wondering is when you just put the drip on, how important is it to try to keep moving that hose? I mean, can the tree get water from basically one spot in the ground and use it for the whole tree? Or for all the branches to benefit, does it really need to get water around the entire drip line? And I've never really understood that because I did a little research on the plume that water makes when you drip into the ground, and it kind of goes out and then it kind of comes back again like that. So it doesn't just kind of keep spreading out. It tends to flow with gravity downward. So I don't know just how much that's going to really benefit the tree.
I think I could address two of those thoughts. One is the type of soil you have does make a difference. So if you have a kind of a sandy soil or a sandy loamy soil, the water is going to go faster down than it will spread. And on the other hand, if you have clay soil and you apply it very slowly, it will spread laterally more and before it goes down. And so you have to apply it very slowly. My answer to the hose problem is if you don't have a permanent drip system, you can, and a lot of people don't for trees. I recommend Netafim if you can use that on your orchard trees, but that's a whole nother story. But a simple solution is like a $5 soaker hose, which is flexible, and you can attach it to a garden hose, and then you can sort of wiggle it around as best as possible around the canopy underneath the tree, and then turn your faucet as low as possible, but at least it's going to drip in sort of a rough circle. It doesn't have to be the perfect, perimeter, but it will benefit from, I often suggest that's a case where you might turn it on very low overnight. You're not wetting the foliage, you're just wetting the roots. And it is also important to be aware that when a tree is young, a lot of times people want to water right there at the root ball, which is good. But 5 years down the road, the roots that are absorbing the water, they're at the tips. And so you actually don't want to get the trunk wet. And this is a failing for people who stand at the trunk of a tree with a hose, letting the water spill right there. Not only isn't it actually watering the tree, but it can do harm. So as much as possible, get the water around the tree. Sometimes you'll see in commercial orchards, they just have little spray attachments at either end, sometimes only on one side. That is simply because they just don't have the wherewithal, the money to do it properly, but not because it's not proper to water all the way around.
Okay,
Robin?
thank you.
Anita, you have a question?
You talked about, if anybody else doesn't have a question, I do have another one.
I do have a question.
Anita
Thank
had a
you.
question.
So one of my questions is, I'm so new to all of this that first of all, I want to say thank you. All of this is really helpful. I have not planted my trees yet, so I'm really excited that I have some guidance before I do that. I have a crepe myrtle and it's a single trunk, right? Is it possible that it becomes multiple trunks? Can you explain a little bit about multiple trunks and single trunks and what I can do? Because it's rather tall. It's taller than I am. I'm really small. So that's, so what do I do to support this tree and being kind of more natural than where it's been pruned to?
Okay, well, in the case of crepe myrtles, basically the crepe myrtle naturally is a multi-trunk tree. So in order to make them into like a sort of a mock lollipop where it's a single trunk with all the branches on top, yes, kind of like that picture that McKenna's pulling up there. That's been done in a nursery, and they've literally cut out all the branches and they've trained just one to be dominant, and that's okay. In your case, if they've cut them all and trained them for quite a while, sometimes you will see suckers come in from the bottom. The problem is that if it's grafted, you may find that whatever comes in from the bottom is not going to be the same cultivar that's on the top. And there are some tricks to seeing a little dormant bud on the trunk, and you can sometimes take a little knife and stimulate that bud to break and form a new limb. But those are things that are a little bit more advanced tree care, and they don't always work. It's probably easier and simpler to simply buy a multi-trunk crepe myrtle if that's what your choice is. You may find if it's a small enough tree, it may branch anyway, because trees don't actually grow from the bottom up, they grow from the top. So whatever branches are down low now, they will always be down low. They're not going to grow up with the tree. Those low limbs will always be there. And so you can just leave them. I think there was another part of your question. And if you haven't planted your trees, it's very important to look at the root ball. So when you take it out of the container, I think I mentioned it a little earlier, but unfortunately, trees in the Southwest are almost always grown and produced in containers in nurseries here in the Southwest. And it does a pretty bad disservice to trees because it doesn't take very long for the roots to get too big for the pot. And the longer they sit in the pot, the more likely they are to coil round and round. And if you don't unwind them before you plant them, those roots will not unwind in the ground for you. So it's sort of a double-edged sword that you will stress the tree by unwinding them. And if you have to cut them because they're rigid, you're going to stress the tree. But in the big scheme of things, it's much better to do it now than 10 years down the road to find your tree strangles itself. So anyone who has not already planted their tree, I would refer people to look at the resources on the guideline sheets and look at what you should do to do some root pruning before you plant your tree.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So John, if you wouldn't mind asking, we'll have maybe 2 more minutes before we're going to end our session here. So if you have one final question that we can answer in a couple minutes, that'd be great. If it's longer, perhaps you can email and we can get that question to Robin.
Well, they were talking about nitrogen fertilizer, and I typically don't buy fertilizers, commercial ones. I make a mulch, compost basically. And is that in the end going to provide a sufficient fertilization for a tree to produce fruit? My fig tree seems to do well with it, but is that ultimately going to be sufficient to just keep giving it composted kitchen waste as a top dressing? Because I don't buy anything, so no.
Yes, I would agree with that. you know, there are times when you want to fertilize a tree, and if a tree is sick, is actually the wrong time to fertilize. In fact, if your tree is ailing, it's probably better to find out what's the matter with it rather than dumping fertilizer on it. You're liable to hurt it worse. And naturally, if you think about it, all trees drop their leaves, even evergreen trees drop their leaves. They just drop them all year rather than all at once.
Oh,
And where do they drop them? Nature knows exactly where to drop the leaves, right at the canopy and all the way under, not quite up to the trunk. And so all those trees are doing is basically feeding themselves. So it's kind of silly that we have developed a phobia almost about dead leaves on our properties, because it's actually nature's way of providing tree food. And so it's a good idea to leave your leaves. That's a, you know, whether you compost them or just leave them in place, unless they are diseased, in which case you should clean them up. But if the leaves are just dead, they're perfectly good fertilizer and carbon, and it will go back into the soil.
Excellent.
And using your home compost is perfect as well. Again, as long as you've composted enough for the pathogens to break down or cook off, in effect, get hot enough. It's a really good idea. We do occasionally use blood meal, which is essentially an organic fertilizer, very high in nitrogen, but very sparingly on our fruit trees. But you know, for the most part, you're fine. Like on a fig, they don't need a lot, and they will drop their leaves, and they drop a lot of them because edible figs, unlike the ornamental figs, are deciduous here in San Diego.
yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you, Robin. Anita, you want to close us out?
Sure will. So thank you so much. I really want to just extend such gratitude for both McKenna and Robin, who Robin brings the wealth and knowledge, and McKenna really put in the time and energy to create a wonderful presentation and an opportunity for us to talk about taking care of our trees, not only in our yards, but sort of externally here in our county. And so I invite anyone who wasn't able to make this call to email us at membershipdirectorlcgc@gmail.com, or Lemon Grove Community Garden email that you'll find in your email. And let us know if you have questions. Let us know if you have a desire for us to have a discussion. We can create something that we can all join together and have some ongoing discussions about caring for our trees. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to receive the trees that I've gotten. I'm sure many of our community members are. And so thank you everyone who's made this happen. And we look forward to seeing you at our next workshop, which will be on the 23rd of May. You should receive an email, and we will be talking about ethnobotany and native plants, and really its relationship to the Kumeyaay land here.
I
So
have
thank
one
you.
more comment, just
Awesome.
because I am a master gardener, and I would like that on the record here for distribution and people's awareness, that the master gardeners have a hotline to answer public questions. They have a phone number, they have lots of written resources, and most of the collateral that's online, I believe I put a lot of it into those handouts. And so, you know, it's good for people who have questions to not just rely on what I'm saying today, but also on the wealth of information that the university system makes for the public.
That's amazing. We'll be sure to add that hotline to one of the slides in our resources. So when they do receive the slides, or they email us, they will have access to that. I thank you all so much. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.